Today we're going to talk to Dr. Lubaba Al Azmi, who is the author of Travelers in the Golden Realm. It's a book about Britain's journey from a medieval era to modernity. Her book shines light on an important part of history where Britain was connected to the world through India. And we will have a discussion about that. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, can you just run us through this fascinating evolution wherein Britain, a small divided territory, started looking for partners because they were, exhausted by the ostracization they faced through Catholic Europe, and how they started looking towards the subcontinent?
Absolutely. So when we think of the history of India and England, we often think about Britain's empire. So this idea of the British Raj, company rule, Britain as a colonial empire over a sort of subordinated and subjugated India. So, but the history that my book presents is a sort of overlooked, neglected period that is the first near 200 years prior to Britain's advent of empire. And as you say, that sort of was triggered by England's ostracization from Catholic Europe. Part of that essentially began during the reign of Henry VIII, when Henry VIII he wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, in order to marry Anne Boleyn. And England, as a Catholic nation, needed to have permission. Divorce wasn't necessarily something that was permitted. So then he approached the Pope. The Pope said no. So what eventually happened was England underwent a reformation. It shifted from Catholicism to Protestantism, which then allowed Henry VIII to become sort of the head of the Church of England and then allow his own divorce in order to marry Anne Boleyn. Now, the child that was born of that marriage was Queen Elizabeth I, who would become one of the most powerful queens, monarchs Britain has ever known. So now Henry VIII, because he broke with Rome to do this, the Pope essentially excommunicated him, which meant that he was thrown out of the Church of England. Now, during the reign of Elizabeth I, she too was excommunicated by the Pope. Now, for Elizabeth I, it didn't make a huge amount of difference because she was Protestant anyway. She didn't bow to the church anyway, but it did make a difference to England, the country that she was ruling, because what this essentially meant was that England was thrown out of Catholic Europe, which was majority of Europe in this period. So essentially, it was kind of like the first Brexit, so to speak. So off the back of that, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, what England needed to do was find, much like England had to do after Brexit in modern times, find new global partners. And so they can't turn to most of Europe. They started turning more to the east. So they turned to the Ottomans in Turkey. They turned to North Africa, the Moroccans, and they also turned to India. And so that's the story that my book tells, that England was this island nation. It was ostracized. It wasn't very developed. It certainly wasn't very wealthy. And it needed to find global partners. And it turned to these partners, including Mughal India. Now, part of the reason was because they couldn't really turn to Europe, but also countries like empires like the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Kingdom of Morocco, these were some of the most powerful empires of the period. So my book looks at England's sort of how England shifted to a more global approach towards trade and diplomacy, and particularly how that established the early foundations of England's arrival in India.
That's very fascinating. But I was wondering, how the people at that point in time under the imperial realm, how they managed to deal with that ostracization from such an important economic powerhouse, which was Rome.
Well, I mean, England was having this sort of standoff between Catholicism and Protestantism. The Reformation and this sort of shift to Protestantism inevitably created these rifts. During Elizabeth I's reign, she was kind of known for her Catholic suppression, the fact that she tried to suppress the Catholics in England. And this led to people leaving England, and it led to, and I have a chapter on this in the book, that it led to England's first person to travel to India via ship, who was a Catholic refugee, Queen Elizabeth I's England. His name was Thomas Stevens. So he was someone who was a Catholic in England. He was preaching for Catholicism, and his partner, who he was also preaching with, was arrested. So then he realized that, okay, I'm really not safe here. So then he became a refugee. He left, went off to Rome, and then went on to India. So the first Englishman to go to India was in fact a Catholic refugee, which is an interesting thing to think about in terms of the kind of refugee discussions we're having today,
Mhm.
that the first arrivals to India in this period were in fact English refugees. Um, but also just India was not unknown to England in this time. India was known and sort of fabled in the English imagination and in the wider European imagination in this time because India was seen as the global capital of a lot of riches. So even in medieval texts, such as Mandeville's Travels, which is a very famous 14th century text of travel writing, it refers to India and it goes on about India's diamonds and its spices. And these were some of the commodities that people aspired to in India. And, the connections were there from beforehand because there was the Silk Road. The Silk
Mhm.
Road sort of brought all these commodities overland via the Middle East and then through Venice into the rest of Europe. So what England and also its European competitors were essentially doing was trying to make direct contact with India. It was a land with which already there was very distant contact through lots of intermediaries, but they decided, you know what, let's do this directly, seeing as we're not being able to work with Europe. Let's make these connections more directly. So there was definitely an awareness of India and an awareness of its riches and its power, and in England, they thought, these would be good allies, but particularly in relation to India, these would be good trade partners.
So, did India learn anything at that point in time from these British pilgrims, outcasts, travelers, and did they embrace any of those ideas that came from that part of the world, like Europe?
Well, yes and no. Mainly, India was one of the most advanced and developed nations, empires in the world in this period. So, in terms of its manufacturing industries, far, far advanced to England. In terms of its general economy, far, far advanced to Europe. So, if I give you an example, the Indian economy was agrarian. So, it sort of funded itself through land taxation. And because it was an expanding empire and it was so expansive that it was self-financing. So essentially, it wasn't even dependent on trade because all of its revenue was comfortably covered by its land taxation.
Hmm.
So the coffers were full, whereas in Europe, it was very much about bankers and debt. So England was in debt, France was in debt. All these countries were basically functioning on debt and working with moneylenders and bankers. So the economic model was very, very different. India was very, very self-sufficient. Um, its share of global GDP, for example, outstripped the entirety of Western Europe. So it was very wealthy in that regard. So in that sense, when the English came, the Indians were not very interested in trade with them as such because English goods were basically not very good. England's primary export commodity, was called broadcloth, and it was essentially a fabric that was woven out of wool. Now that's good for Northern Europe where it's cold.
Hmm.
Into India, they've got no use for it.
Yeah.
Whereas in India, it's all about the light cottons and the muslins and the silks. So in terms of trade, they didn't make a very big difference. For a lot of the trade, it was pretty much the English purchasing goods in India with actual cash, with silver. And so India kind of became this great sink of the world's silver because Europeans were coming and just purchasing goods because they couldn't barter in these European commodities.
One interesting aspect I read about in the book was when you say how Indian craftsmen uh, didn't like whatever merchandise British traders were bringing to India, and that put a lot of pressure on British traders to kind of like reinvent the wheel and come up with new solutions, and kind of also gave them some sort of like international perspective, like what can work and what cannot work.
So this is part of how India helped Britain develop its global identity, because it was very much the case that they went to India with broadcloth, and they also took some other goods like tin and lead, and they did manage to sell that a little bit, but not a lot. Um, and they found that we're not being able to sell this stuff, but just purchasing things with mounds of silver is a loss. So let's see what is popular in Mughal markets, and then let's work with that. So by that, they noticed that, for example, the Mughal markets were very fond of ivory, and particularly Indian women were very fond of ivory. They would use it to make jewelry and that sort of thing. And this is something that's in the East India Company records and their letters, that okay, they are very fond of ivory. we should try trading in ivory. So then they started trading in East and West Africa for ivory. And they would purchase that specifically to purchase Indian goods. Now, the interesting thing is that they would use Indian cloth to purchase the African ivory to then go back and sell in India. So because even in Africa, they couldn't really sell their goods, right? So they had to, it was a sort of back and forth and creating of profit through this multi-layered international trade network, so to speak. So certainly it kind of created, well, it nurtured in the English a sort of internationalist creativity
Mm.
to in order to aid this trade in India, let's let's find the goods that are actually saleable in India. So I gave the example of African ivory. They also brought in Indonesian spices. They did these kind of things, and the silver itself was actually often brought in from South America.
Mm.
So a lot of these international connections was what enabled the English to trade in India.
And that started to reflect in English literature. For instance, when you give an example of Shakespeare.
Absolutely. So the Shakespeare's England, which is pretty much the time period that I'm writing about, and approximately a century after, um, is often seen as quite insular. People think that Shakespeare is the quintessential English writer. He's a white man writing about white culture for white people. There's this sense of it's a very insular sort of literature, whereas Shakespeare's literature is in fact replete with internationalism, with people from other communities, other societies. The settings are all over the world. Majority of his plays aren't even set in England. Majority are in fact set in the Mediterranean, which is like the meeting point of three continents.
Hmm.
So absolutely, you see, because England was increasingly internationalist in this period, it was very much emerging in the literature. So, for example, think of one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's people know A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's about fairies, and it's set in Athens, and set in a magical woodland outside of Athens. But few people will perhaps be conscious that the plot of the play is in fact pushed around a story of an Indian boy.
Oh,
So the whole story is, in fact, you've got Oberon and Titania, the fairy king
yeah.
and queen, and they're fighting. And they're fighting, and it's creating, it's messing up the seasons. It's creating havoc for the Athenians. It's creating all kinds of problems. They're completely at war. And the entire cause of that is an Indian boy who is the son of one of Titania's followers who died. And essentially, around that Indian boy, this one Indian boy is pushing the plot of the entire play.
So between 16th and 17th century, how does the story move further in terms of India becoming this window for Britain to the outside world?
So as the 17th century is the majority of the period that I focus on, and it was pretty much in 1600 that the East India Company was formed,
Formed.
and then and I cover up to 1707, which is the death of Alamgir Aurangzeb, who was the last and most powerful of the Mughal emperors. Now, this entire century was an entire century of the English concertedly trying to trade in India, and the entire time they struggled. So it wasn't necessarily a case of they're building and they're becoming stronger and stronger over time. The entire time they were struggling. And several times they almost collapsed and weren't able to continue. So, for example, during the English Civil War, when the crown was overthrown and you had the government of Oliver Cromwell, this republic government, the East India Company at one point actually did put themselves up for sale. They said, right, we can't do this anymore. We actually don't have any funds and we're just going broke at this point. So throughout this century, you've got the English just struggling and struggling, but you have to also admire their resilience. They still stuck with it, even though it was going, at times it was going very bad for them. What helped was that around this Republican period, when they put themselves up for sale, Oliver Cromwell thought, oh God, let's not, that'll end our trade in India. So he granted the East India Company a new charter. They were able to raise fresh funds and sort of revive their trade somewhat. But this whole century that I cover, it gives a very different story of England and
Yes.
India to the story that we've all been told about Britain's empire. The entire century and a half that preceded empire, more than
Yeah.
a century and a half that preceded empire, was an exactly opposite story. It was the story of a powerful and wealthy Mughal India and English petitioners just trying to get a foot in and failing for pretty much that entire period.
But in the process, they also took away a lot of lessons and a lot of knowledge. And Are there any specific areas you would like to touch upon when it comes to how India kind of had some role to play in Britain's Renaissance?
Absolutely. I mean, India was sort of the doorway to Britain's global renaissance. So it was through these admittedly struggled attempts in India that Britain learned to be strategic, learned to be globally strategic, learned to be more internationalist. So for example, the case I just mentioned, that during the Republican government of Oliver Cromwell, the East India Company put themselves up for sale, and then Cromwell granted them this new charter, which enabled them to sort of garner fresh investments. And one of the first things they did with that investment was purchase a company called the Guinea Company. Now, the Guinea Company was an English trading company that had monopoly of English trade in West Africa. Now, the Guinea Company kind of focused more towards typically the trade in enslaved peoples, that really brutal trade, transatlantic slave trade. The East India Company purchased it to get ivory, and to get gold to trade in India. So in that sense, it taught the English to be internationally strategic. So they engaged in trade in West Africa, they engaged in trade in East Africa, they engaged in trade with Persia, because Persian horses were very popular in India, especially in the Mughal court. Persian silks were also very valued. Um, so, and then they traded it with Indonesia, and the spice from Indonesia was also traded in India, as well as sent back to England, because that was the main impetus to go into that region in the first place. They also attempted to trade in Japan to try to get silver from Japan so they don't have to bring it all the way from South America. So it very much triggered England's global awakening in that sense, and England's global connectivity. So in that sense, I mean, one of the things that I hope that readers can take from this book I mean, at the one end, how the history of India, the story we've been told, is only half the story, the history
Yeah.
of England and India. So what I really want is people to know the other half of the story that hasn't been told. Um, but another thing I'm keen for people to realize is that England has long been a global land, has had a global identity for a very long time, has been engaged in migration, immigration, emigration, trade. All of these things have been happening for at least 400 years, um, but really for much longer. So we get this idea that England became sort of more diverse post-war, post-World Wars. But really, that story starts a lot earlier. It starts around the 1500s, 1600s. And that's part of the story that I'm telling here as well.
And now when you look at these, I'm bringing you to this current reality of England, like these race riots that are happening, unfortunately. Uh, do you think that this is a time for the people of the United Kingdom to kind of revisit their history, wherein being an open society, a melting pot of civilizations, and a diverse society has been, as you said, part of their DNA if you go all the way back to 400 years. Uh, it's not something new that is happening if a refugee from a war-torn African country is trying to find refuge in England. Uh, you probably know there are a lot of parallels that we see in history. And is there something you can discuss with us along those lines?
Sure. I mean, I think that understanding our history is crucial to understanding our present. And I think part of the thing that really is necessary in England and in general his school curriculums is to know the richness of history and the diversity of history, and to know this aspect of British history, that it has been, and for a very long time, a very international land and an international country, and that is British identity, that is English identity. Um, so from the 1500s and 1600s, England has been connecting with the wider world on a very concerted level. And it was England that went and sought out the wider world. The wider world didn't come seeking England.
Yeah.
Right? Mughal India didn't seek England at all. England sent two ambassadors, three if you include one ambassador that went during the Reformation, but he was actually trying to represent the exiled king through the 17th century. Mughal India never sent a single ambassador, right? So in that sense, England was the one that sought out the wider world. And then that seeking out for trade and for diplomacy later transformed itself into empire. But this was very much England seeking a global identity and establishing a global identity for itself.
And anchored that. India anchored that.
India absolutely anchored that. India became sort of a sort of crucible within which England developed its global identity. From India,
So in the beginning of the chat we're having, you said that it kind of reminds you of now what is like post Brexit UK, when you compare it with the time when England was isolated from the Catholic Europe. What made you draw that parallel?
sure. I mean, when I was sort of looking into Elizabeth's excommunication, the kind of factors that surrounded England's global turn, I just kept finding echoes of what was going on. So, because I did my PhD through this Brexit period, so that was the time that I was sort of researching England's sort of travels to the Ottomans and the Persians and the Mughals in India, and sort of kind of understanding what was going on. And around 2016 was when all this was happening. So for me, the parallels are very striking. So ever since that, I guess it was also the time that I was working in. It struck me, and it seems quite an apt sort of comparison.
Any striking example you can give us?
Um, well, I mean, the fact that we left the EU was a bit like the fact that we left Catholic Europe. Europe was the majority of Europe in this time. Our only ally was like Netherlands in this period, the Dutch, because they were also Protestant, and they were just fighting off Catholic Spain as well. They warred with Spain for a long time, and lots of English soldiers fought on the Dutch side against Catholic Spain. So there were lots of parallels because by England being excommunicated, it meant that we sort of had this economic rift, but also it was a military rift. It was a diplomatic rift. It was a trade rift. Um, so we really needed allies in order to sustain, in order to economically sustain ourselves, but also militarily sustain ourselves and diplomatically sustain ourselves. And so making these partnerships with, for example, the Ottomans and the Kingdom of Morocco was sort of a strategic partnership that Queen Elizabeth I did, because the Ottomans and the Moroccans didn't like the Spanish either.
I
They
mean,
also had, sorry.
I was just like, this is fascinating, like what you're saying, and also was thinking about like how it kind of has completed this long circle now after Brexit, the UK again looking at India as a promising market.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, with India, it was very much okay, let's trade with them and get the world's most valuable commodities, which was spice, at the source. And then we can enrich ourselves and we can be independent of Europe. We can survive without having to trade with our actual cousins on the continent. So this was all like, it kind of snowballed in that sort of way. And in the same way, England after Brexit started seeking trade partnerships with America and Australia and New Zealand, seeking and India, as you say.
Absolutely.
So you see very many of these parallels, and it of course makes you think that history, it doesn't necessarily always repeat, but it certainly rhymes, and we always wonder how much we learn from it.
On this note, this is a perfect note, I think, to wrap up this conversation. And yeah, it just thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.